Welcome to Just Break Up, the podcast about love, heartbreak, and all the relationship advice you don't want to hear. My name is Sierra DeMulder.
And I'm Sam Blackwell, and today we're going to answer a letter from somebody who is trying to redefine her relationship with her sister. But before we begin, we just want to give you our Surgeon General's warning, which is that Sierra and I are not licensed mental health practitioners.
No, we are definitely not. We are not professionals. We are not accredited or trained in any of this. So please take our advice as you see fit, as a supplement, if you will, to your other mental health practices. We are just here to offer our humble musings to hopefully shed some understanding and maybe some laughs about the incredibly rewarding but mostly confusing experience that is love. All right, so it's the first episode of the week, so we're going to start with a quick check-in topic before diving into this episode's letter. The check-in topic is inspired by something I saw on the internet, per usual.
Love that. Love that.
I think it was a post on maybe queer sex therapy, but I'm not doing my homework and checking right now because I just remembered the idea of it. It was arguing that healthy communication skills were or are a form of generational wealth. And that gave me pause. I have mixed feelings about that idea, both like positive and not so positive. Just the idea that, you know, the ability to communicate in a healthy way, to process your emotions, to give yourself the opportunity to have a response instead of an emotional reaction, you know, the skills of listening and articulation, that as a form of generational wealth, because I think the argument that they were making was that gets handed down from generation to generation. You know, there's a reason why all these parenting accounts these days talk about being generational cycle breakers, you know. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that idea to the podcast and sort of respond to it. Again, it's not mine, and I don't know whose it is. I tried to Google it, but yeah. So I'll just start. My initial reaction, I felt a little adverse to it because I think when I think of generational wealth, it means something very specific to me. And we're talking about, like, you know, the access to resources and opportunities that things like money provide you. You know what I mean? The sense of security and opportunity that provides to you. I did Google generational wealth to be like, what are we talking about when we use that phrase? That placeholder of language. And the internet tells me it refers to any assets passed down by one generation of a family to another. So the poet in me, I can see a way in which we can look at the word assets and be like, well, what are you truly passing down? You know, are you passing down health? Are you passing down financial stability? Are you passing down property? Are you passing down trauma? You know, that's where the poet in me is. The poet in me sees how that can be a sort of a flexible thing. And also, I definitely had that first reaction of like, do we want to talk about generational wealth in a way that isn't just calling it exactly what it is? Because it is such a gatekeeper in a way, you know? Like money, you can't really like argue that it's not primarily that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure that whoever posted this like was thinking about this in terms of like passing on something of value to your children. But I do think that like, yeah, absolutely. But like generational wealth, I think, is really tied up in like systems of capitalism and racism and the history in the United States of like slavery and displacement and genocide, right? Like there's like people have generational wealth for really specific reasons, which are often bad, right? Are coming from places of like that are not good. Bad. Yeah, absolutely, right? And of course, like naming this as somebody who has had access to general wealth or generational wealth because of the color of my skin and all of that, right? Like, so I don't want the idea of like passing on healthy communication styles to be tied to this like thing of like money hoarding that is also currently happening. And that's like some people deserve to pass on wealth to other people, and some people don't, just because of all of the different reasons that we've already talked about. And I also I don't like the idea of communication or health being something that you accrue and amass for yourself, right?
And keep forever. Because it's not like if I had healthy communication skills, that the baby I pop out is going to have that.
Absolutely. And it's just because you have learned a particular way that works for you in terms of how you communicate and how you process through things doesn't mean that it's the only or best way. And that in 20 years, when your child is 20 years old, we might learn that actually some of the ways that we handled things before were actually really harmful, right? The idea that it's something that we sort of put in our bank accounts and it just continues to grow over time, it's takes the nuance out of the idea that we all have different things to learn, and that we all have to find ways to shift and adapt how we communicate based on what we're learning about ourselves and the people around us. And I don't like the idea that we just kind of hoard it or keep it and then only pass it to our children or the people who are directly in line from us.
I really
what does
love
it look like to think about
critique.
Communication styles as more mutual aid, right?
Yeah.
How do we support each other in learning and adapting and holding each other in ways that are helpful, rather than only being concerned with, am I passing on the right communication styles to my children?
I'm also thinking about it from the point of view of being a parent right now. Two things come to mind. I can communicate to my child as in as healthy of a way as I possibly can, and I'm still going to snap. I'm still going to have a reaction that I don't sort of agree, that I'm not proud of. And more than that, my child is I can hand my child all of those skills, and they're the ones that have to learn how to wield them. Do you know what I mean? Communication. I think where this idea of communication as generational wealth, as much as I love it, I love the idea that you're giving your child this huge gift, is I think the sentiment they're trying to get across. It's also, I think it's setting ourselves up for the fallacy that is so much of human relationships. The idea that if I do X, Y, and Z, it's going to equal this. I'm going to be healed. I'm going to pass that threshold. I'm never going to get into an argument again. I'm never going to feel this way again. You know what I mean? And you can speak respectfully and with boundaries and gentleness and honesty and you can mirror all of those good, healthy communication experiences for your child, and they're still going to have to walk out into the world and talk to people who have different communication styles than they will. And they're still going to have to learn what it feels like to be honest, even though that person doesn't want to hear what you have to say or whatnot. I'm thinking about it now in terms of, not that it's a bad sentiment, although I think all of our critiques are valid, but that it almost sets the parent up. I can't produce a perfectly healed child, no matter how healed I am. You know what I mean?
For sure. That's real. Yep. Because you're going to do something that you think is good in this moment, and that has a repercussion that you're not expecting, because that's what life is.
And even if I'm wholly good, what if I magically make every correct decision? That child is still in their own body, in their own world, experiencing, I don't know. I do love the idea of, when I became a parent last year, all of a sudden you really realize the weight of your own healing. That I am working on myself now so that I don't put what my parents put on me on my child. I'm doing that for her, So I do really love the idea that we see this sort of, oh my God, to steal another economic term, a trickle down effect of healing. Do you know what I mean? But also that it's never going to include the amass diversity of the human experience, and because it's thinking about things linearly. It's thinking about like healing as savings and not an ongoing process of existing,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, all of those things. And I do appreciate the idea of like, of keeping in mind that like our own healing also benefits those around us, right? Like, I think that's wonderful. And I really enjoyed that sentiment. And so I'd love to think about how we can do that in a way that is about not just like my direct descendants, but also about like, how is taking care of myself and understanding my own stuff actually serving me to be more and better independent or interdependent with others around me, not just like the children that I have. I mean, obviously that's really important and you spend the most time with your child. So like, I totally get that, but it's also about like, how are you doing that in relationship with everyone around you and not just like the person who's like the next in line in my like family.
Another thing that comes to mind is just thinking about the lesson to take from this is, for me and my personality type, is it's worth it to work on your own healing because of the ripple effect. For somebody who's a people pleaser, for somebody who often tamps down my own issues to focus on other people because in like a dysfunctional way, in a codependent way, it's beneficial for everyone, for each of us to claim our own shit. You know what I mean? It's beneficial for everyone, for me to work on my healing because of how it ripples from one person to another.
For sure.
Don't love that ripple metaphor, but I'm just going to go with it because it's a Checkin Topic.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, cool. Thanks for giving me your thoughts on that. I was excited to hear how you felt about it. All right. Cool. So let's dive into today's letter.
All right. This letter comes from Boundaries Land, whose pronouns are she, her, who's writing from the void. Hi, Sam, Sierra, and Spencer. Longtime listener of the pod here, and I can confidently say that hearing y'all answer letters each week makes my life so much better. I'm writing in about a really difficult and complex problem that often feels really sticky to tackle: family. For context, my family is a bit of a mess. I am the youngest of 3 siblings. My siblings are significantly years apart in age from me. When I was born, my mother took on a motherly role and helped my mom raise me. She was in high school at the time because my father worked so much. Since I was born, she has been a huge part of my life. When I was younger, she felt a lot more like a parent than a sister. It was difficult for us to transition our relationship to being friends as adults, and I personally think it was harder for her to see me grow into an individual person that didn't necessarily need her in the same ways that I did as a child. Especially when I went away to college, there was a lot of friction between us because I was making decisions for myself for the first time, a lot of which she didn't necessarily agree with. We have a narcissistic parents and have leaned on each other a lot throughout the years for support. And I think a lot of our relationship is based around giving each other the care and love that this parent didn't provide for us. So here's where my dilemma comes in. I am ready for our relationship to change. Since forever, we've talked and texted throughout the day, and I recently got married and went away on my honeymoon where I didn't have cell service. I felt relieved to have so much needed space around our communication and its frequency. Not because I don't love her or want to talk with her, but because I find texting and talking constantly exhausting. Especially now, she is single and recently embarked on a fertility journey. I will be an aunt soon, which is very exciting, but also, as horrible as this is to say, scary. Because I feel that she will be relying on me even more for support since she has chosen to take this journey by herself and without a partner. I struggle with boundaries in general, but I feel like especially with her, since when I slow down my responses or don't have much to say, she'll ask me if something is wrong. And the reality is something isn't necessarily wrong. I just don't know how to tell her that I don't want to talk all the time without hurting her feelings. As someone who is already very anxious, this is giving me a lot of stress and making me feel like not only a bad sibling, but also a bad person. I would really appreciate any advice you two have to give on setting boundaries in ways that are effective, but don't cause so much hurt. And really, any insight on this would be beneficial. Even writing this out really helped. Thank you. Much love. Boundaries.
Okay, my darling boundaries, thank you so much for writing and for listening and for trusting us with this letter. I am so grateful to answer it. I think, speaking of cycle breaking, I think changing the established pattern of a relationship such as this, one that has been, really core to your development and has been there from the beginning, it's so challenging. And I have a feeling that this is going to be like the onion effect, right? Once you peel back one layer of codependency or whatever we want to call it, I don't totally know the intricacies of the relationship, but the healing journey is often one of, layers of clarity, layers of illumination. I have a feeling that as you move through this journey, you're going to become more and more resolute about your patterns of behavior with your sister and her patterns of behavior with you. You're on a good journey. It's a hard journey, but I'm really glad they're here right now. And there's definitely a way you can navigate this with compassion for yourself, for your independence, for your capacity for communication, and for your sister at the same time. And we're going to get into all of that. But first, we have to take a very quick break.
All right, everyone, welcome back. Boundaries, thank you again for writing to us and for offering us an insight into what your experience is like sort of navigating this relationship with your sister. And I think where I kind of wanted to start is really talking about boundaries and what boundaries mean. Because I think that there's a lot of stuff out there, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, but there's a lot of narrative around what boundaries are and what they should look like. And often we kind of conflate boundaries with this idea of I get to tell you what to do, right? I have a boundary, and so you need to stop. And that's not actually what a boundary is, right? A boundary is an internal process that we decide for ourselves around how we're going to react and respond when people do things, right? What is the thing that I'm going to do in order to protect my peace? What is the thing that I'm going to do in order to, not feel stressed all the time about how my sister is talking to me or how much my sister is talking to me? And so I think as you're thinking about what do boundaries look like, it can be really intimidating if we think about boundaries as I need to somehow get this person to stop doing this thing.
Oh my God, yes.
Whew, that's really hard. Your sister is not you. You have actually very little control over what your sister does or doesn't, or how often she texts you, whether or not she calls you, right? All of that is all up to her. She gets to decide. So the question for you is, how do you want to react or respond to what your sister's behavior? And there's lots of different ways that you could respond in this. And some of it could look like you telling her how this is landing on you and that you want a different relationship with her. It could look like you putting her on silent so that you don't check your phone. You don't see the notification when she texts you, so you can decide when you want to respond. It may look like you saying, okay, I'm going to respond to her between the hours of 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. And other than that, that's it, right? Everything else can wait until the next day. But the setting of the boundaries for you is actually about what you want to do in this situation, and not actually how do I get my sister to stop texting me so often, right? That piece is impossible for you to control. But the piece that you can control is, what do you want to do knowing that she's probably going to continue to text you a lot, continue to call you a lot, because that's the pattern that you're currently in.
Yeah, I totally agree. The word pattern really does resonate with me because, if you've been following along for a while and been either listening between the lines or listening to our Patreon episodes where I get a lot more explicit because it's behind a paywall. I've had some changes internally in my heart with some of my family members, particularly one over the last couple of years. And so much of that unraveling was allowing myself to see that so much of our dynamic was a call and response, like dance, and not necessarily, in alignment with my actual authentic feelings. Like, perfect example is this texting relationship that you're describing. I relate to it so much because the call and response is family member text you so you respond. That's the call and response. They text you and you respond. What's wild is that if we actually pump the brakes and think, I actually have a choice as to whether or not I respond to this now, and that it's not this immediate need that our attachment, that our relationship, that our history tells us that it is, all of a sudden, literally the ground comes out from under us. You know what I mean? If you start looking at the patterns of these types of relationships and realizing that they are just that they're just a pattern, and that they actually can be different. It's so world altering. Like, that's why I led with the onion metaphor, right? Because once you see that you don't have to respond to the text message, not that you don't have to respond ever, although you could do that, but like maybe you don't have to respond right away. Somebody in my family always asks me for the weather because they do not have an iPhone, because they don't have internet, if you catch my drift as to who this person is.
I do. I know who you're talking about.
And it took me like literally 3 weeks to be like, I don't have to respond right away if it's not a there's something about this, the world of this time of the internet and immediacy and access, that if somebody reaches out to you via email, it's like, oh my God, I have to respond right away. But that's like, that might be what capitalism tells you is the most respectful way. But that's not natural to our thought process, to our focus, to our intuition, to our boundaries. Like, shit, man, we used to have to send like fucking courier pigeons or like a man on a horse to send a message. Like, we have lost all sense of patience, and that goes both ways in terms of like, we don't give ourselves any patience. So what would it look like if you, like Sam said, I have done this with family members. I have people who I have this sort of tie to, this call and response programmed into me. I have had to I mute their text message. It's not that I don't respond. We're still in relationship with one another. I still respond to their fucking text messages. I just don't see them as it's like a small road bump on the path to our connection, right? That bump disrupts the pattern. That bump, I don't see the text then, so it doesn't rule my day. What would happen with this person, this family member that I'm talking about, when they would text me? My nervous system would go off because it had been so conditioned to be a particular player in this relationship by that person, And so I just felt this knee-jerk reaction that I had to be what this family member needed me to be. And so a simple text message and the decision not to respond to a text message or to leave them waiting would stress my system out, literally like stress out my nervous system. So I decided to mute them on my phone so that I still get they're not blocked, but I don't get the notification that they text me. And that small little road bump gave me something to slow it down, to slow down that nervous system response, and remind me that I have the agency over how and when I communicate with this person, and that like I can be a cycle breaker, that I can be a habit breaker if not a cycle breaker.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that because it's like, it's not necessarily like you're like full, like, I'm not responding to you ever, or like, you need to stop texting me. It's just like, how do I set up ways for myself to remind myself of what my goal is?
That is 100% true. And I just want to, before you jump back in, earlier you said boundaries are an internal process. And I think that's so true, because my boundary wasn't to not have a relationship with this person. My boundary was to remind myself that I am an independent person outside of this relationship, and that I can actively participate in it in the way that I choose, not the way that they orchestrate. And so literally just muting those text messages was a small little like reminder pop up on my phone that was like, you're in charge. You're in charge of how you interact.
Yes.
It's all internal. It literally has no impact on that person. You know what I mean?
For sure. Absolutely. And that like you responding to the family member was a choice that you were making, right? Like it didn't feel like you had a choice, but now that you've said like, now that you've offered yourself this like speed bump, you can say like, wait a minute, I do have a choice here. I don't have to respond immediately. I can choose to respond later and they can deal with it. Like they can find the weather if they need to from someplace else, right? Like, and I know that like for you, it didn't necessarily feel super constructive to have a conversation with this family member about like what you were doing and why, because it would not be received well. Right? And I think that that's like totally legit. And I also want to say to you, boundaries, that like, I don't know what your relationship is like with your sister and like how close you are and how capable you both are talking about this type of stuff, but it is a possibility for you to say to her like what your plan is and say all of the things that you said to us, right? Like, I love you. I love communicating with you. I want to continue to be there in your life. And also I am trying to, not spend as much time responding immediately to the things that you send me. So I'm going to respond absolutely, but it might be a few hours later. So I just want you to know that, right? Or you could even say like the amount of contact we have with each other every day feels a little overwhelming to me. Can we make an intention to talk on the phone every other day as opposed to texting all the time during the day, right? Like if you think that she's going to be a co-conspirator in this, right? Like if you think that she's capable of hearing this stuff and working with you towards a solution that feels more holistic, love it, right? Like do that. Cause like, I think it's rare to have people in our lives who can hear that kind of stuff and instead of being like, oh my God, she hates me, instead be like, oh yeah, I want to be in a relationship with you too. And I'm hearing this isn't working. So like, what can we find differently? And so like, if that's available to you, use it, right? I know that that's really hard and crunchy, but like, I love that. And at the same time, if that's not going to go well, I think you can also follow Sierra's route here, right? Like you don't have to have a whole conversation about what's going on here, right? You don't, if she's like, wait a minute, you're not texting me back immediately. What's wrong? You can say, there's nothing wrong. You could say, I'm trying to spend less time staring at my phone, so I am not responding to texts immediately. You can say, right, like, oh, I'm sorry, I just was busy and I didn't notice that you text. You don't owe it to her to like tell her everything about your own decisions about how you're going to respond if you don't think that she's going to handle that information well. You're not lying. All of those things are absolutely true.
Yeah, she might not handle it well if you don't want to participate in, you could still have that conversation even if she's not going to handle it well.
Absolutely, that's true.
Yeah. I literally, you could take a script out of, 18 of the things that Sam just said, and put them in text response, put them in a note, on your phone and just copy and paste them. I also wanted to add, like, I do think this might, be noticeable to her. It might not be, honestly. Like the people in my life that I've pulled away from haven't said anything to me, but they're notoriously emotionally aloof. So, what I was going to add is if there is some tension, from the other party, or if you see this coming out in other ways, like it sounds like she thinks she knows what's best for your life, and that doesn't just come out via constant texting. So maybe another, peel of the onion is going to be you deciding that you no longer want her unsolicited advice, or you are going to feel, confident enough to disagree with her or whatever. I don't know what I don't know what the dynamic is wholly in this relationship, but you can, write down a couple phrases that express, clear boundaries while being emotionally neutral. That has been really helpful to me. Like, oh, I appreciate that, but I'm not really interested in feedback. Or, I don't want to discuss that with you. That's like very emotionally neutral if you think about it. Like, oh, I really appreciate you, your concern. Or what did you recently, you reminded me of a phrase, Sam, maybe it was on a Patreon, where it's like, that sounds like it will work for you. Isn't it your friend said that recently or something like that?
Yeah.
It was on a Patreon episode. It was like last week where we talked about, really sitting with the understanding that like we don't know what's best for other people.
Yeah, absolutely. I was talking to a friend and I was complaining about a coworker and I was like, I just wish that they would do it this way. And she was like, that way sounds like it would work really well for you, but it's not going to work super well for that person. And I was like,
but that's a perfect phrase to be like,
absolutely true.
I think that, if she's offering advice that is unsolicited or overstepping or whatever it is, you can say, that would probably work for you. I don't know if it will work for me. It's like a variation of it's a variation of the cheerful and stupid. It's not that you're ignoring her. It's not that you're picking a fight or instigating anything. It's just simply you deciding that you have agency and you can say something clearly and with boundaries, internal boundaries, while being emotionally neutral or considerate. You know what I mean? I think that we think of those boundaries, like you set it up so perfectly earlier, that like we think of them as changing the way people act around us, or really hard, firm things like, nope, you can't do that. It's more about how am I going to respond when this family inevitably oversteps their reach on my life. When that parent makes the comment about your child's clothing, or when your sibling makes a comment about how you spend your time on your phone. You can say, well, that it works for you, but this doesn't work for me. Boundaries are so much about creating that agency for yourself within yourself.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. You can say, I appreciate how much you care, and I'm going to make my own decision.
Yeah.
Right? Like all of that, like Sierra said, I think the important thing is to recognize that like you're not being like, oh my God, you're a terrible person for giving me advice, right? Like it's more like I hear what you're saying, and also I get to decide because I am an independent person who gets to make decisions about what I'm going to do in my life. And that may be really rough for her to hear. Absolutely. And then if it is, like, then you can make some more decisions about how you're going to respond in the future, right? Like if she flies off the handle because you said that, then then maybe you don't respond at all to the advice that she's giving you, right? Or maybe you just say, okay, and move on, right? Like there's lots of different ways that you can respond to it. But again, it's about your response, not necessarily about changing her behavior. And you could also, again, like if she is able to hear this, you can say, it's really hard for me when you give me this advice on things that I'm trying to figure out for myself. I would appreciate it if you wouldn't do that anymore, right? Like you can say that, but again, if she's not going to change her behavior, then you have to decide how you're going to respond to it.
Right, exactly. All right, my darling, we hope that this helps. I know there's, a lot of like well-laid paths here in your relationship, but you have agency in this, and you have every right to not respond to a text message immediately all the time.
Yes, absolutely.
All right.
Thank you so much for listening. We love you.
We love you so much. We hope this helps.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. If you would like more content from us, or if you would like ad-free episodes, you can always support us on Patreon. If you support us on Patreon for as little as $5 a month, you'll get an additional bonus weekly episode. That's patreon.com/justbreakuppod. You can slide into our DMs, send us your favorite relationship meme, but most importantly, you can submit your questions about all matters of the heart at justbreakuppod.com, which is also where you can find our merchandise. Please remember to like, follow, subscribe, give us a 5-star rating and review. This literally keeps our mics on and helps us reach more brokenhearted souls who need two random strangers giving them relationship advice. Just Break Up is a production of Duvid Media, original music, recording, editing, producing, all magical things from our good friend Spencer Worth Davis. Make sure to check out his podcast. And remember, having boundaries is an internal process. It is a gift that you give yourself to remind you that you are safe, that you are a safe haven for yourself, an advocate for yourself, and you have agency
and the ability to do things differently. And if all else fails,
just break up.